proposed change 1 to the Wellington Regional Policy Statement 2013. We have Jason and Matt. It's all yours.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for making the time for two district planning items today, 10.3 and 10.4. This first item, 10.3, is a little bit of a departure from what you normally hear from me and my team. Instead of a paper, which sometimes is rather lengthy, apologies for that, which is about us developing a change to our district plan. This paper is actually a draft submission on a different authority's efforts to change its own document, Greater Wellington Regional Council, and its regional policy statement. So Greater Wellington's regional policy statement, and you'll get this, I think, from the paper, is a really significant document for this district and indeed for all of the territorial authorities in the Wellington region. In the hierarchy of things, and the RMA, we've talked about this multiple times over the triennium, the RMA sets up a hierarchy of things, and the district plan has to be consistent with, give effect to various higher order documents. We've talked a lot about national policy statements and national environmental standards over the last 3 years. This is actually a regional level document which has significant powers over our district plan. And so it is a really important document for the district to be keeping an eye on, being involved with, and in a situation like this where a change to it is proposed, to put a submission in there and make sure that we are able to participate in that change process. And there's a key point there. That is what the purpose of this submission is. It is to give this council the opportunity to have their say in the next steps of the process. It's an important thing to do, to put in a well thought through, thorough and clear submission. And that the reason why that's so important is we are essentially laying the platform for our participation in the next steps of this process. And I'll just briefly explain what those next steps are. And they should be rather familiar to you because they are pretty much the same as the steps that we've talked about when we change our own district plan. So what Greater Wellington has recently done is they've publicly notified their change 1 to their regional policy statement. Previous to that, they'd actually put out a draft, and we had prepared a pretty comprehensive submission on that, and we have had a discussion about this before back then. So they've just publicly notified this document, and now the public, everybody, ourselves, our iwi partners, all have the opportunity to lodge a formal submission. And that is what we're seeking your approval for today, and it's attached to the paper. Once the submission period closes, the next step will be going through what's called a further submissions process, and that's an opportunity for all those who wish to, who meet the criteria that the RMA sets for who can make a further submission, to have their say about what everyone else wants to do with change 1. And so council, subject to making a decision to put a submission in today, will have the ability to make comments on other parties' submission points, and other parties will have the opportunity to have their say about the submission points that this council makes. Council will have the opportunity then to reflect on its original submission in light of what other people have said and the reasons why they've said it, because that's what they need to do in a further submission. Once the further submission process is done, Greater Wellington will have a look at all of the submissions and further submissions, and they will create a report which is called a Section 42A report. And that report will be put to an independent hearings panel, or in this case, and I don't want to complicate this too much, there's actually going to be potentially 2 panels, because some of this plan change relates to freshwater matters, and there is a specific process for dealing with freshwater matters under the RMA. But I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, because it's a heck of a rabbit hole. There will be a 42A report written where Greater Wellington gives non-binding advice to the hearings panel. Let's just keep it simple and talk about one panel. And we, as a council, subject to making a decision to putting in a submission in today, will have an opportunity to put our thoughts directly to that panel as well. And whether or not those are exactly the same thoughts as what we've expressed in a submission that we put in now, or whether we evolve that slightly, having considered things like what other parties said in response to our submission, what Greater Wellington said about our submission to the hearings panel, you have the ability as a council to modify within the scope that you set in your original submission your position. So in the next triennium, there will still be chances for council to revisit exactly what it thinks about RPS Change 1. Then the independent hearings panel they'll consider all of the feedback that they've received, and they'll retire, they'll prepare a report and recommendations, and that will be presented back to Greater Wellington for its consideration. And at that point, Greater Wellington, and typically the process is it would adopt that report and recommendations as its own decision, and that would open up a period to publicly notify that decision to adopt. That would open up a period for appeals. That's the next steps in the process, and I just wanted to position where we are today relative to all those steps. Those steps are going to take quite some time. If there's one thing that councillors probably have learned about planning in the last 3 years, it's more of a marathon than a sprint. And Greater Wellington has to follow the RMA process just like council does. So that's where we're at in terms of the process. I have my good friend here, Matt Musprat, who helped prepare the submission that's before you today. And you will see in the paper and in the submission that we have identified some quite significant issues with this change. If I was to summarise in one cliche what this RPS change looks like, it could be that the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
That's a bloody good quote, eh? Just hold your comments.
Mr. Mayor, I was just going to ask if we could talk about the process before we get on to the next stage, just because they're probably two separate.
Yep.
Yeah. That's probably a good point for me to pause and stop and hand over to yourself, Mr. Mayor.
Right. Can I? We have question time. I'm looking at page 253 under the climate change factor. You got at least 3 areas where you say, despite territorial authorities having no function under the RMA to control emissions to air, and another 2 of them, despite the district plan not having legal authority to manage these activities. What does it tell you? What is it trying to tell? What are you trying to tell us here?
Okay, I will let Matt answer a lot of questions because he's very good. But there's a common theme that you will have seen in many parts of our submission, and that is that Greater Wellington in RPS Change 1 has not drafted a change that, in our view, matches what they're asking us to do, by way of district plan change with what the RMA gives us as functions. And that's setting us up. This is one of the implications that we really wanted to draw to council's attention. It's setting us up for a very difficult time trying to progress plan changes that actually rub up against what we're allowed to do. So that's why in many parts of this submission, despite the fact that council, of course, has announced in many different ways how serious it is about the climate change issue, but we've had to recommend opposing a lot of aspects of Change One's approach to the climate change issue because they've used the wrong tool, i.e. directing us to do a district plan change to address the issue when it's outside our functions to be able to do that.
That's interesting because we had a briefing recently on our attempt to talk or have a conversation with the communities about reducing carbon emissions district-wide and what tools we have. So within ourselves, there is the tension, right? But having said that, I just want to come back to my next one. You have stated very clearly that planning is a marathon, not a sprint. But the MDRS legislation is a sprint. It's a 50-meter sprint, I think. And here you have a requirement on page 253 in climate change. I read requirements for district plans include provisions that will require urban greening to provide urban cooling and a suburb scale tree canopy target of 30% by 2050 and methods to achieve this. How do we give your intensification? And then you have this particularly, this comes to fruition. How do you balance that? And on top of that sits the National Policy Statement on Biodiversity. On top of that, the NSP, NPS on highly productive soils. Is this the road to hell you're talking about?
We obviously do have a series of higher order documents that are creating a lot of challenges for us going forward. That's okay. That's okay where it's within our actual functions to be able to do the things we're being asked to do. I think that an element of planning that makes it such a enjoyable and thought-provoking area is that we are being asked to deal with multiple massive issues all at once in a way that is integrated. That is a part of the challenge of planning. It's obviously a part of the challenge of council, but we need to ensure that Greater Wellington is actually asking us to do things that we can do. And some elements of this also are a little hard to see how they're going to be achieved in practice, and we have interrogated their Section 32 evaluation. You'll recall how thorough Council's Section 32 evaluation was for Plan Change 2. I think it was 1,800 pages famously, with a lot of effort to try to justify that the intervention that's being proposed actually made sense with evidence. Now, we've looked at that for Greater Wellington's Change 1, and we don't find evidence to support that many of the interventions are actually going to be the right choice, the right tool, or that there's any evidence that they're going to be effective. And that's of concern, and that's why we've put forward a submission for your consideration that is quite strong.
Councillor McCann.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Sorry, my intention before was I thought it might be really good time to have questions about the process before letting Matt and Jason talk about the rest of the report before we get stuck into that. Sorry if that wasn't clear.
Do you want to do that now? I was under the impression that the process was explained.
I was going to ask a question about the process because that's what they talked about. May
Cool.
I do that, Mr. Mayor?
Yeah.
With the process, in that final report that Greater Wellington Regional Council put in, are we able to see that before we respond the final time, or does it happen simultaneously and we don't know what their final position is?
So you're talking about the timing of their recommending report to the hearings panel. Yes, typically my understanding is we will have the opportunity to view that and it will inform our evidence to the hearing.
And within that process, and I realise this part of the year is a bit of a mess, but within that process, will there be the opportunity for a briefing in the next triennium about what your responses are and whether we need to also have conversations with councillors in Greater Wellington Regional Council?
I would really like to have a briefing where we do explain to you how we think relative to the initial position that council had, how we think the landscape may or may not have changed in the light of what further submitters have said and what Greater Wellington's also said to the hearings panel. I think that would be a very healthy thing to do.
And just for the purposes of being collegial, Councillor, the Deputy Mayor and I were discussing that, so it's not an idea just from Rob, it is from the new Green Coalition. Thank you very much.
Councillor Compton.
Thank you. Through the Mayor, there seems to be a lot in this proposed plan change one that we're saying in the submission is inconsistent or outright prohibited by the Resource Management Act. So, assuming that GWRC has a pool of experts such as yourselves who advise them on this, how do they get to a position where they're suggesting stuff that's inconsistent, and that's being generous with the RMA, or is this the classic case of 78 different councils having 78 different interpretations of the Resource Management Act?
I think we always have to preface what we say is that this is our considered advice. And we are all looking from our own lenses at words in an act. And it's entirely possible when you see it all the time that two perfectly sane, sensible, well-educated in matters planning people can look at the same section and come to a different point of view. In this case, though, we're looking at sections 30 and 31 of the Resource Management Act, and those are the sections that respectively set out the functions of a regional council and a territorial authority. And if we take an example of greenhouse gas emissions, they are, I understand, a contaminant that we're talking about discharging to air. From our considered point of view, Section 30 is about as clear as it can be. The functions of regional councils are to control discharges of contaminants to air. So, Matt, have you got anything to add there?
I'll just add too. A lot of the time, the opposition that is in the submission isn't on what the issue is trying to be addressed. It's about the method of delivery by requiring district plans to have rules for things that fall outside of the council's function. And we have, in preparing this, have had quite in-depth technical discussions with planners from the other city and district councils in the region, and yeah, we are all on the same page in terms of the concerns that are expressed in the submission.
That's very helpful, and forgive me, I've got a number of questions on this paper because it's obviously has some pretty big implications for our district. There's discussion in this about GWRC attempting to presuppose what the final form of the National Policy Statement on Indigenous Biodiversity would be. Now, my understanding is that councils around the country have come unstuck trying to do this with previous national policy statements and before they've been finalised, and it's caused them to have to go back and do another plan change subsequent. So that sort of approach, if they pursued it, is going to potentially add significant cost both for them and us, and ultimately it's the same pool of ratepayers funding that. Is that a fair assumption in terms of what could potentially play out there?
Yes, that's perfectly summarised.
Cool. So you talked about the process before, and you illustrated it's going to drag on for quite a while. Presumably, by the fact that we're participating, making a submission, we could get to the point, and other councils in the district, the region could get to the point where we take environment court action against stuff, and you could get into this absurd situation where the city and district councils are in the environment court against the regional council, arguing the toss over who does what. I mean, what sort of time frame are we looking at for this whole process to play out if it went to court, and are we going to conclude that before the heat death of the universe?
I guess I am guessing here about the exact time frames, and I'm not sure if Greater Wellington could answer that with absolute certainty either, because they're obviously, much like us with Plan Change 2, you don't know how many submissions you're going to get. You don't know how many submission points each submission will make. So there's always a question mark about the complexity of a hearing before you know what the final form of submissions are. But I would anticipate a hearing next year, and I would imagine a decision by the end of the year, or potentially it could drag to being early 2024 at the latest, I would have thought. And so the appeals period could be late 2023 or early 2024. And then, look, as we've experienced in this district, when it comes to how long does it take to resolve appeals, you just cannot answer that question.
How long's a piece of string, basically?
Yeah.
So I guess more about the substance of the submission. We list numerous east-west connectors in terms of that on page 313 of Council Papers, page 55 of the submission, in terms of the regionally significant infrastructure. And I noticed that we haven't included Mill and Tasman roads in Otaki, and yet we've got included in there the parade in Paikakariki and the Esplanade in Noromati South. So I'm just trying to understand, how does that work? Because I would have thought that Mill Road and Tasman Road and Otaki GWRC would have thought that they were fairly significant local arterial roads, or is it a case of GWRC forgetting that Otaki exists again?
Yeah, it could be that. Yeah, so the advice we had on the listing of the roads for the submission was from the transport team. But what we can do is check with the transportation team as to the status of those roads within the network, and you'll see one of the recommendations we have put forward is the ability to make minor additions or corrections to the submission prior to lodging. So we could certainly take that question away and get to the bottom of it.
Cool. In terms of, staying on that same page, in terms of Kapiti Coast Airport being included in there as regionally significant infrastructure, it was obviously included in the original 2013 regional policy statement. Do we know what evidence GWRC has relied on to define it as a piece of regionally significant infrastructure? Have they looked at how it's used throughout the rest of the region? Have they looked at its role, other roles it holds or people think it holds?
I don't actually know the answer to that, but I suspect that they, maybe if I go back a step, in this case, because it was already in the regional policy statement, they seem to only be changing the name of the airport. So I guess the justification that they would feel they would require to change the name in terms of like the length of the backstory that the Section 32 evaluation would have to tell would be a pretty short story. Were they to be either recommending through the change to either introduce it for the first time or remove it entirely, then one would expect to see quite a long story justifying why that was appropriate. But in this case, because they're essentially just changing the name, and we don't actually know the reason why they're doing that either, I don't think there is a lot of justification behind it.
Cool. I guess my next question is, given that we're supporting the inclusion of it as, or the retention of it, I suppose, as a piece of regionally significant infrastructure, and we have in the long-term plan the work program around exploring options for the airport. I mean, I guess we're all well aware that there are questions raised about the the viability and the future operation of that airport. Have we actually engaged with the airport owners as per the LTP work program in order to explore what those options might be? I mean, if we're saying that it's a regionally significant piece of infrastructure, one would think in the last 15 months we would have carried out some engagement with the owners of that infrastructure. Do we know?
I personally couldn't answer that question, sorry, councillor. I'm not sure whether there's anybody in the back who can. Yeah, sorry, councillor, I can't add anything there.
Cool.
Chris?
Thank you, Chair. I think the position we were taking with this initial submission to the Greater Regional Council was on the basis of what is in place now. Part of the reason we wanted to describe the process that we're going to step through with this submission is that as we evolve our conversation around the airport, there'll be an opportunity for us to adjust that position if we get to that point of landing an option for that. So we've based it off where we are today, which is, yes, we're exploring it, but we haven't made a decision. So there is going to be, over the next, well, it might be 3 to 5 years, plenty of opportunity for us to be clear about our position on that. And I think, Matt, you might want to just touch base on the legislative sort of slant of this. We would need to make sure that we were putting our own evidence forward to support that change, rather than just we're exploring it. There wouldn't be enough to change that position at the moment.
So at the moment, they are a designated airport. They have a designation to run as an airport under the RMA, which makes them immune to a lot of district plan provisions as long as they're operating as an airport. And airports are listed in the RMA as infrastructure. And Wellington Regional Council has made the call that it's a regionally significant airport. So there would need to be some sort of change in one of those, I guess, 3 points, in my opinion.
Cool. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Just following up on that, so but is any party out there can make a submission challenging that, right? Okay. Anybody else? Councillor Holbrook?
Yeah, it's a hefty submission, so it's hard to go through and talk about everything that's in there. But I get the general principle that the cascade isn't working. You know, the cascade of responsibilities is broken with this particular plan change. So all we've got in front of us, as far as I could see in the submission, is a table. Are we making a general statement to that effect?
Yeah, we often do, councillor, don't we? We will put a cover letter together at the front, which conveys in more sort of conversational terms, perhaps, what the key themes of our submission are. I'm sure we can put one of those together in the same way that we've done it in previous times.
Yeah. Just around, I can't find the page number that it's on because I didn't take any notes on that page, but so in the town centres section, we identified that some of the town centres were left off, but Otaki was in there, so it's not just Otaki that's being forgotten through there. Ramaki Town Centre was also forgotten, would that be fair to say?
Yes, we spent some time looking at that part of RPS Change 1, kind of with sort of one eyebrow up and furrowed brows, really, because we were struggling to understand what they were trying to do with the change, and we couldn't find anything in the Section 32 report to make that any clearer. So typically a regional policy statement won't get into locally significant things. They never gave us any reason why they were in this case. that's why the submission on that point suggests that the RPS should stick to what RPSs should stick to, which is regionally significant things, and not list locally significant centres at all. But certainly, if they were going to list them, we have a hierarchy of centres in the district, and they had picked a couple of our town centres at that part of the hierarchy. We also have Raumati Beach and Paraparaumu Beach. So yeah, there was no story behind the why.
Yeah, the one eyebrow raised and the furrowed brow's working working well there. So I'm wondering about the timing of the new the pieces of legislation that are going to replace the RMA in terms of this piece of work. How far down the track are those new pieces of legislation?
So I think we are expecting to see exposure drafts of 2 of the 3 new instruments by the end of the year. In fact, I think it may be quite a bit sooner than that.
It was supposed to be September.
So it might not be.
It's nearly run out.
Yeah.
Would it make sense if you were going to make major changes to a regional policy statement to base that on the most up-to-date legislation? And could we, as a council, along with other councils, just suggest hitting pause until we know what that's going to look like? Because at the moment they're doing a huge piece of work. I mean, this is massive change to a regional policy statement that gives effect to a piece of legislation that's soon going to be out of date. It doesn't very well give effect to it, to be honest, but that's what it's attempting to do. And some of what we have a problem with might be addressed through the new legislation, which will, potentially have more allowances around issues like climate change.
Mm-hmm. Did you want
to? A large component of the plan change is to address requirements in the freshwater NPS and the urban development NPS. And so the urban development requirements are sooner than the freshwater requirements, but because of the interplay between new urban development and the impacts on freshwater, they've brought the freshwater components forward. And what we think is going to happen with the reforms is that the newer national direction will be incorporated, probably in a slightly amended form, but will be incorporated into the new legislation. That's my understanding of how they're intending the legislation to work, but we won't know until they release the exposure drafts. So they do have a clock that's ticking under those 2 NPSs for addressing specific things, but in our view they've gone far beyond the matters that they're required to address. So there are a lot of components where the council, and I think we are suggesting, they hit pause. We've even suggested certain parts be withdrawn. Yes.
Thanks for all the work that's gone into this. It's huge. Thanks.
Councillor Barano.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Jason and Matt, for speaking to this today. So I just wanted to seek clarification on a point on page 252. This is in the first, under the box there. In there it's got, and I suppose I'm wondering what the implications are for KCDC here. It's got here, what density of development must be enabled when rezoning land for urban development? What does that actually mean? Clarification on that, please.
Yes, so in the plan change, there's a suggested policy that's, I'll start at the beginning. So the NPS for urban development requires the regional council to have direction in its RPS on how territorial authorities treat plan changes that will realise a lot of housing capacity, and which is fine. But what they've done is they've said in that policy that when considering those plan changes, you must rezone it for medium density residential. So it's very specific. It doesn't give the council, on our reading, the flexibility to consider other zones that may form part of a well-functioning urban environment like commercial zones, those sorts of things, or even high density. Yeah, they've been very specific about the zone that must be applied for new urban development, and it's just very restricting on the council's options. And in our view, they don't have the authority under the NPSUD to be that specific on councils.
Yeah, so thank you for that. So I know that there have been some conversations in two particular community groups about renewing their lease arrangements. They're on reserve land, council reserve land, and potentially that they may be, there's issues over the longevity of those leases, because potentially that land could be used for housing intensification. Is this basically one of the potential implications of this?
Only if the council was to be rezoning the land for urban development. The RPS is saying, well, if you're rezoning land for urban development, it must allow for medium density residential. I can't comment on the lease type.
Yeah. So basically, there is no obligation or no expectation that council would be doing that. That's probably a bigger question. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure, councillor, if this is going to answer your question, but I mean, council's not obliged to rezone land to general residential, either now or by RPS change 1. I think what we're saying here is we've got an NPS urban development which has come in, and medium density residential standards that have followed it, which adds already a high degree of prescriptiveness to how we are to grow, how we are to provide for additional housing, which of course we must and should. And we're querying in this draft submission, what do we really need the RPS to come in and add extra layers of prescriptiveness? And in our view, neither is that necessary or particularly welcome, particularly given, again, that there's not a lot of justification behind why that particular way of doing things that the RPS says is the right way of doing things. We think it's better for council to have discretion, the ability to have a bit more influence about how we grow than what RPS change 1 is suggesting.
Just hang on, councillor. Mike and Duncan.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Council. Look, I just wanted to make the point that with respect to the specific situation that you're talking about, Jason isn't aware of that, and we actually keep a separation of duties. But I think the conversation has moved on from your question, but I just wanted to make that point at the time that the council's hat as a landowner is different from the council's hat as a planner and as a regulator. So we haven't actually discussed this with Jason or his team.
You got another question?
I do, thank you. So then, in terms of the bigger picture, given that statement, so I've read through the submission. So what is the council actually saying anything about that in their submission?
Yes, the submission, I don't have the page number in front of me, but the submission seeks that, I think that clause be deleted, that they're not specifically directing the council on what zones must be applied.
Okay, right, thank you.
Right, Councillor Elliott.
Thank you. I've got a pretty quick question. Councillor Compton suggested the additions of Mill Road and Tasman Road Otaki as main arterial routes. Wouldn't it be a cunning plan for us to add Te Horo Beach Road
That's RMA speak.
to that list? Yeah. Could we add Te Horo Beach Road to that little list of suggested amendments
As a cunning plan.
as a cunning plan?
Yeah, look, we're very happy to take those suggestions to the transport team
Yeah.
and
He's shaking his head.
yeah, and check with them and see whether or not that would make sense.
Can
And-
we
and
just
if-
get Sean to respond?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There are criteria associated with that description and inclusion, and some of it relates to traffic volumes and things like that. So we have to go back and check the numbers, but that may be why Mill Road was excluded in terms of traffic volume. But Te Horo Beach Road, I expect, possibly wouldn't trigger the traffic volume criteria. But you're happy to, as Jason's mentioned, we'll go back and double check. But we can't just slip a few extra ones in there, sadly.
Councillor Holiday.
Through you, Mr. Chair. And look, thank you for that, Jason, because having that explanation with regards to our stance and all these sorts of things is really good to know, because, yeah, some things just didn't really sort of add up. But look, one thing I just wanted to touch on was on climate change, page 253. It says, taking more of a risk-based approach to the management of all natural hazards in line with modern planning practice. The concern I've got around that is we still don't know what's going to turn up with regards to things. And while I appreciate the risk elements there, and we don't know what's going to turn up, we already have issues around natural hazards. My concern is that if we're cranking the dial up, that generally has a flow on of unintended consequences to development, not from a broader sense, but from a quite a specific areas sense. And we hear that already people have trouble getting through our consenting processes as such. This potentially has the ability to make this a lot more complex, but generally what I'm hearing is that a lot of this stuff's coming without the backstory as such, and we don't really know where we're going with this. And it's good to see that we're pushing back against it.
Yeah, that's right. So what we're asking for is that the language used in the policy reflects that which is used in the Act around inappropriate subdivision use and development around natural hazards, and also the wording of the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement, just so there's no inconsistency for decision makers on resource consents. When reading the RPS, that doesn't say the same thing as the RMA or the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. So we're asking for consistency of the use of terms.
And would it be a fair comment to say that, in regards to you've reached out to other local authorities around the place, that generally that's a general view with regards to wanting to try and approach what are going to be some very challenging situations in the not too distant future, but we want to be all on the same page with regards to how we approach it.
Yes, as Matt's quite rightly said, yeah, we have reached out to the extent we can with the timeframes that are put on us, and yeah, I think it is fair to say that there is a high degree of unanimity across the districts of the region that the RPS Change 1 has the flaws that we've talked about today.
Right, anybody else? Otherwise, can somebody move recommendations A, B, and C from page 251, 252? Councillor Compton, seconded by Councillor Elliott. Councillor Compton, right of intro.
First, I want to really acknowledge the district planning team for the amazing work that they have done on this and across the triennium. You've certainly had, I think, an unprecedented volume of work chucked at you, and you keep getting new things like this put on top of it. And the advice you give us has always been first rate, and you've always been very open to us working through that advice and the contestability of it. And I think nearly always we come back to the advice that you gave us in the first place, which I think speaks measures of your expertise and the respect with which you're held in the council. So, you know, I won't be round the table when you're progressing this next time, but I wish you the best of luck, and hopefully you'll get this done before the entire universe goes cold.
Thank you, Councillor.
Right, open for debate. Councillor Holbrow.
Yeah, talk of that, and would add that it's a singular skill to make planning fun.
Right, Councillor McCann.
I just note that there was some ambiguity there as to whether you did make it fun, but I just want to say I did find it fun, and I know perfectly well that the Deputy Mayor was going to actually say that as well. Thank you.
Anybody else? I suppose I just need to add my little bit. Planning, you said, is a marathon. I think it's also a philosophy, and you have grown in that direction.
I know what you mean.
Yeah. Hey, look, anybody else? Anybody else? Okay. Recommendations A, B, and C, moved by Councillor Compton, seconded by Councillor Elliott. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against? Carried. Thank you very much. The next paper is still on the same theme, but who's speaking on that? Item 10.4, Council Report on Plan Change 1B, Managing Liquefaction Risk.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So apologies from Ellen, who was the author of this paper. She's doing the Making Good Decisions course today, actually, which is great.
I think recertification.
So, resetting, completely different topic. Back to what we ordinarily come and talk to you about, and that is progressing changes to our own district plan. And this is a change that was part of a suite of changes that we characterise as omnibus changes. So you're familiar, of course, with Plan Change 2, the intensification plan change, the big rock in the jar, if you like. Well, also what we've progressed this triennium is a package of 13 smaller, I think it's fair to say, plan changes under the umbrella of what we call an omnibus set of plan changes. And so we initially publicly talked about the scope of this work back in October 2021, and that's when you gave us approval to go ahead, do the work, consult on a draft, and report back to you once we'd done that. So that was October 2021, and in that paper there was 13 issues or topics raised, and one of those was this one. So we've called this Managing Liquefaction Risk, and really the purpose of Plan Change 1B was to reduce unhelpful, unnecessary duplication between two regulatory instruments. And so let me just briefly explain what that duplication was caused by. So it was actually caused by an expansion of the building code into managing liquefaction risk for new buildings, and that followed the Christchurch earthquakes. And it had been an expansion of those standards that had only applied to Christchurch up until November 2021. Then it applied nationally. And what that meant was, we in the district plan, we had a rule which was quite rightly looking to manage that issue through the district plan for new builds. And with the expansion of those standards, all of a sudden we had this duplication. We had the district plan dealing with the issue, we had the building code dealing with the issue. And Plan Change 1B was about saying it makes, nobody wins, there's no benefit in having people needing to have two things covering the same issue. You're needing to get consent under the district plan and a permission under the building code. Makes no sense, doesn't add any value. So Plan Change 1B was about getting the district plan out of the way, recognising that there was a perfectly effective national instrument, the building code, to deal with the issue now. Wasn't a duplication before November 2021, but it was after that. So we publicly notified, we came back to council and you approved public notification of the first 3 of the omnibus package way back in February this year. And Plan Change 1B was one of those 3. And so it went through the submissions period and we got no submissions on Plan Change 1B at all, which speaks to what a common sense change it is. That's quite unusual. The RMA is not really written for the scenario where you don't get a submission on a plan change, because you pretty much always get a submission on a plan change. In this case, we've got no submissions at all. So that was quite good in the sense of an efficient process from here. We talked with the lawyers, as you do, when you come up with a slightly unusual circumstance that you haven't dealt with before under the RMA. And we wanted to check in about what would be the point. See, what you typically do is you would do at this point a public notification of council's decision on provisions and submissions lodged. And then you'd wait for 30 working days while people have the chance to have an appeal. And if they don't have an appeal, say, then you come back to council again seeking approval, final approval for the plan. But in this case, we didn't have any submissions, so nobody could lodge an appeal. So we went to the lawyers and we checked in and we said, wouldn't it make a lot of sense if we couldn't go to one council meeting and work through all of the remaining steps and finish Plan Change 1B? And their answer was, it would make sense, and yes, you can. And you need to do that by having the recommendations in the right order. And if you do that, it's perfectly appropriate that you can complete Plan Change 1B at this meeting. And so that's essentially what I'm here to seek your approval for. We've identified two options in the paper. One is to, I guess, do as we recommend and do those final steps today. And another would be to do it, it's kind of the old-fashioned way. When you get a submission, you do that two-step process that I talked about. You wait for the appeals period to go through, and then you come back and you do another decision. But we're advising you again, based on the legal advice, that there is just no point in having two meetings for this. It's far more efficient to deal with all this in one step. So that's what these recommendations are designed to enable you to do, is to finish Plan Change 1B.
Councillor Holbrook.
Yeah, I'm very happy with this approach, as long as we're certain that we carried out, I'm sure we did, but I just want it on the record that we carried out all the reasonable steps to seek submissions, and that this is just such a logical thing to do in the plan that there was no issue with that within the community.
Yes.
Would that be fair?
Yes, absolutely. I can give you that assurance. The Resource Management Act is very clear about the requirements when public notification occurs, and we met those requirements. There were public notices put in the local newspapers, and there are all the usual social media steps which go over and above what the Resource Management Act requires. We followed those. So I can give that categorical assurance.
Mr. James Jefferson.
Trying to turn red. There I go. Look, if I can add to Jason's reassurance through the RMA process, we had a workshop with probably about 60 developers, their agents, architects, engineers in here pre the November 21 changes, because they were, as often happens, they were fostered on us very, very quickly with nothing from central government in terms of how we communicated this. But we had that workshop, and that we were quite clear in that workshop in this chambers that there would be plan change coming. So if I can give that extra reassurance, but that was actually really, really well received, and I think we were quite proactive in that space. Hopefully that helps.
Councillor McCann.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Mayor, to James. And in those workshops, there were no concerns raised that we didn't react to. Thank you very much.
Just a clarification. So now the Building Act will manage this.
Yes. I
was always under the impression that the land use consent is the one that comes first before you decide what you want to put on it. It's at that stage that you would require the land use for whatever it is that the issue of liquefaction comes in.
So the district plan has and will continue to have liquefaction as an issue that it can be considered at the subdivision stage. But yes, this just removes that now pointless exercise of requiring it to be at the land use consent stage.
But it's still sort of dormant there in the district plan.
Yeah, so this has actually been a change that, by virtue of it not having any submissions, we've actually been able to treat it as operative ever since submissions closed in March. So we've been living under the regime that we're now looking to absolutely make final for the best part of 6 months now. So this is just making this last procedural step to finalise things.
Cool. Right, anybody else? Otherwise, is somebody willing to move recommendations A, B, C, and D? Councillor McCann, Councillor Holliday seconds it. Right of intro.
Happy to waive that, other than just acknowledge the work done by the staff and the good common sense that we're showing and moving this and progressing it forward.
Debate. Councillor Holliday.
And I just wanted to add with the comments that were at the last on the last point that we just covered. Just add to that, Jason, how you simplify this and make that very, very understandable for us is an art form. And I just want to thank you very much, because it's a very complex topic. But when you guys come to the table with us, you walk it through us in a very, very reasonable way, which untangles a heck of a lot of what could potentially be gobbledygook and complexity. So that we can understand it. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right. Anybody else? No? So recommendations A, B, C, and D, moved by Councillor McCann, seconded by Councillor Holliday. All those in favour say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next, item 10.5, amendments to the council delegations to staff, page 320. Janice. Oh, Sarah Body.
Kia ora koutou, through you, Mr. Mayor. So this paper is fairly routine. So it proposes some position and title changes to both the Council to Staff delegations and the Council Resource Management Act delegations. So the key changes relate to the inclusion of the position of the Deputy CE and Acting CE in the Council to Staff delegations. So just better clarification of what those delegations are, as well as position and title changes relating to strategy and growth, the Project Management Office, resource consents and compliance, and access and transport team. So I'll largely take this paper as read, and unless there are any queries.
Right. Any questions, queries? Councillor Pravanov.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair, thank you for speaking of this paper. So just for clarity, this is about title changes, no changes to the actual delegations themselves.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome, Denise. Right. Anybody else? Nope. So would somebody like to move recommendation A and B? Councillor Elliott, seconded by Councillor Halbrow. Right of intro.
Look, I'd like to thank staff very much for bringing this to our table. I've seen many of these, so I'm quite familiar with it. Thank you very much for your work.
Right, and then we had this massive debate. Councillor Halbrow.
Seeing as it's the last meeting and we're thanking staff, I'd like to thank Sarah for the incredible work over the last few years. There's been some really challenging times, particularly some difficult interface with the community and some of our elected members, and it's just carried yourself with such professionalism and skill through some really challenging issues. So thank you very much for the effort that you've put in.
Well said.
Thank you. Can I just say that obviously couldn't do any of it without the team, and in particular this paper is Sarah Lloyd, who has been with us for a number of years, is heavily involved in drafting these.
Cool. Right. Recommendations A and B moved by Councillor Elliott, seconded by Councillor Holbrook. All those in favour say aye. Those against? Carried. Thank you so much. Item 10.6, draft submission to the inquiry into the future of inter-regional passenger rail in New Zealand. And I hope Councillor Compton doesn't say choo-choo. Yes. There you go, Hamish.
Morena, Mr Chair, councillors. We're here this morning to present to you for your consideration a draft submission on the inquiry into the future of inter-regional passenger rail in New Zealand. The submission builds on what is quite a lengthy period of putting forward and supporting recommendations around the need for improved passenger rail services in our district. This looks to build on, in particular, a lot of the work we've undertaken around the growth strategy, which lays as a foundation improved connectivity to help support future growth and good growth and growing well across our district from the north and south and to beyond our district boundaries. And also as part of that, focusing on the climate change opportunities around how we grow and using public transport at the foundation of that, and in particular the opportunity around rail services to support that growth going forward. So the submission before you represents an opportunity just to put our case and story to the inquiry in support of those future opportunities about how we grow well for Kapiti. So happy to take the report as read and take any questions you might have on it.
Questions? Councillor Compton.
Thank you. Through the Mayor, we talk in the submission about that western corridor from Palmerston North through to Wellington. Was any consideration given to also how that network could connect through to Wanganui and New Plymouth and off to the Bay of Plenty as well? Because I know a lot of the intercity, inter-regional transport discussion is around how you could link up the network to those broader areas.
I can't comment on the wider scope, but I know that we have been focusing in particular around the Wellington Regional Growth Framework and those interconnections up to our neighbours Horowhenua District Council and also up into Palmerston North. But we can look at making those connections more broadly as well. It is looking at the opportunities for inter-regional, and of course as the regionals become better connected, the further opportunity and further connectedness further reinforces the need for the likes of rail transport to support that. So we can certainly, if on your guidance and recommendation of the table, would be happy to kind of add or reflect some more of that further context in there, if that would be helpful to reinforce the purpose of our submission for Kapiti.
Yeah, perfect.
Right, Councillor Hanford.
Yeah, kia ora. I'm just wondering if in the kind of introductory little section there it would be worth, and whether it's possible to mention how important specifically for Kapiti, considering how much of our carbon emissions profile is consisting of our transport emissions, whether it could be worth actually really spelling that out to say that 56% of our emissions as a district are from our transport sector, and so it's a crucial lever for us as a district addressing our climate challenges and doing our bit to play a role in the wider regional response to climate. And I'd personally like to see that kind of come through a little bit more clearly as to just how crucial it is for our district.
Right, Councillor Elliott.
Thank you both. I understand the focus of this process was around public transport, but do you think there was scope within the submission to add freight in any way to the wording, especially considering Palmerston North is the home of a large inland port for transport of freight.
Anita.
Thank you. The terms of reference from the Select Committee specifically reference passenger rail and what they are focused on. We could potentially add a comment in there that it's connected and also important, but it's not specifically what they're looking at with this inquiry.
Councillor Halliday.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Look, I actually wanted to endorse Councillor Hanford's view around this, but I've got a slightly different take on this. We had a briefing recently, an emissions briefing, with regards to between 2001 and 2018-19, we as a district, our emissions are up by 25-odd%, which means that we're going the wrong way with regards to dealing with this problem. In my opinion, we need to, well, I'd be interested to hear others perhaps, but I'd be very keen to see a lot of weight put on that information with regards to this now being significant as a lever to address how we as a nation are going to deal with climate issues. If we want to get real about action, this can't be just dragging on for years and years and years, and this number going in the wrong direction. We need to have rail and public transport, but specifically we're talking rail here, that has to be low cost to the user, connected and green. And it needs to be a high priority if we really do want to start the mentality shift towards mode change with regards to things. I think that needs to be very, very, very strongly articulated in this document. I know it has been articulated, but I think it needs to be very, very strongly articulated, because we need to send a clear message that action needs to happen sooner rather than later. Potentially that could feed into whatever the government's going to dangle as carrots with regards to double tracking, etc., and trains for this area in the near future. But that at least lays a platform for us to speak loudly in this space. And I don't know who's going to be sitting around this table next time. I'm very hopeful it's the young lady that's sitting next door to me, who will be a very, very strong voice for the next 3 years in that space, and it'd be great to give a platform and some ammunition to use.
Councillor Pravanov.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to, I suppose, pick up the 2 points that the two previous councillors have talked about here. So this council has, we've issued a climate emergency, and we've got various aspirations that we want to attain, and we've spent a lot of time talking about that. But I suppose that there is a disconnect between what our aspirations are with timelines and what other people, I suppose, like GW, other entities that we are reliant on. And it's actually issuing a challenge, I'd like to see in the document, a challenge being issued to the other people or entities who play a part in improving inter-regional transport, and in this instance rail transport, to actually work together to actually to make a real difference, rather than saying we'd like to do this but we can't because other people who we're reliant on, such as GW, in terms of buses for instance, don't have quite the same timelines as us.
Right. So anybody else? No. Councillor Compton, I knew you'd put your hand up there. Recommendations A1, 2 and 3. Councillor Compton is moving it. Can I have a seconder? Councillor Holbrow. Right of intro.
So I know people accuse me of having a one-track mind over this.
Here we go.
But you'll forgive me for building up a head of steam and wanting to railroad through the most important, this important public transport infrastructure and services that we know that our regions really badly need. But on a serious note, I can't help but feel that this Select Committee inquiry that was initiated by the government MPs on that Select Committee is a bit of a face-saving measure for them, because the government rightly got an absolute bollocking from our region's mayors and the chair of the regional councils over their failure to invest in intercity rail in this year's budget and their refusal to commit to funding it in years ahead. And that's despite Waka Kotahi, their own transport agency, telling them that they should do it. That's in spite of all the regional councils and district and city councils throughout the Lower North Island also telling them that they were going to invest and pay half of the cost for them as well. So, you know, I can't help, as I said, I can't help but feel that this is a bit of a face-saving exercise for the government to try and let off a little bit of the pressure that's built up on them. But as the saying goes, talk is cheap, and what really matters is what the government is actually going to deliver in next year's budget. And I sort of, I've mentioned this before, I feel like they're sort of leaving it to be an election bribe, which I think is always a bit unfortunate. They need to be making these infrastructure commitments throughout the parliamentary term, not just dangling it over voters at the last minute. But ultimately what matters is rather than having the rubber hit the road, we need to have the trains hit the tracks. So let's choo-choo this.
Well, continuing to chew on this is Councillor Holbrook.
Oh, yes, it's got a one-track mind, it does, Gwen. But, yeah, I just want to, because we're doing this today, take the opportunity to thank Hamish for the incredible work that you've done over the years, you two, Anita, but Hamish particularly for the work you've done around Wainui Whenua and supporting and holding that group while they prepare themselves to get that major support through the Greater Wellington Regional Council alongside iwi. So I just want to acknowledge, because that was something that was kind of above and beyond on top of the other really professional work that you do at Council.
Councillor McCann.
Thank you. And I'd like to think when I was counting there, that was 6 puns, which is a record for you. But I do think that there was a really important point here, that there is a lot of advocacy and a lot of noise that needs to be made by anyone who is representing our council, whether it is in the community board or at this table, about the need for the government and or a prospective government to stump up and come up with a plan that they can't get out of post-election. Our community is waiting for this investment. It's vital, and we can all play a role. And I think the role that Gwen has played in advocacy using the newspapers and media is one that we've got to take up that mantle if he retires from that, which I doubt he will. But we should be able to supplement that voice and make sure that it is heard, one voice from the community about that absolute need for public transport specifically. Thank you.
Right. Anybody else? Otherwise, no. Recommendations A, 1, 2, and 3 moved by Councillor Compton. Oh, you want the right reply there? Huh? Moved by Councillor Compton and seconded by Councillor Holbrook. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Thank you very much. You're still on the next one. Item 10.6 or 10.7. Draft submission to self-contained motor vehicles legislation bill. Hamish.
Thank you. So this is, again, another submission in on a piece of legislation that's proposed currently to help certify and better regulate self-contained motor vehicles, which fit as part of the Freedom Camping Act and activity nationally. So we're taking the opportunity to put forward and provide some feedback on the proposals, which are primarily looking around that self-regulation of self-contained vehicles. We're taking the opportunity to highlight a number of ongoing areas of feedback that we've had around the Freedom Camping Act itself, which is slightly broader than just self-contained vehicles, but in particular around that new proposed approach for how they're regulated. Some components both in support of how that's undertaken, and then some seeking some further changes and definitions. I just wanted to draw attention to a slight error in the drafting of the draft submission on the bottom of page 346, the last paragraph. There's actually a point there where we look to, and mistakenly put in, we're looking to include definition, whereas that should actually be exclude. And the purpose of that point there is trying to make quite clear that from the perspective of freedom camping and kapiti, we are advocating through the submission that its definition should not include homelessness within the term of freedom camping, but also that it shouldn't be looking at including people who live more permanently in vehicles as well as freedom campers, as those are slightly different activities from the take that we have of the freedom activity and the purpose of the bill. And so we'll be looking just to adjust that, but it reflects the sentiment in that wider definitional change that we're seeking to actually exclude and separate to avoid any confusion around those other uses with freedom camping. So just noting that, otherwise take the report as read and happy to take questions. And we have Jackie here at the back as well, if there's any more detailed compliance questions as well. Thank you.
Councillor Elliott.
Thank you very much, Hamish. I have a question on page 347 of the paper copy, and that is on offences relating to regulating self-contained motor vehicles. And I note that the submission says that the recommendation from staff is that the duplication is removed, recognising police as the appropriate agency with warranted powers under the Crimes Act, So my question is, police don't have time to police anything to do with our beaches, our beach bylaws, who's driving on the beaches, and other areas like that outside of direct police work, as it is. And are we not, as a council, already there regulating the numbers of motorhomes in our designated spaces each day and each night and their activities? Yeah, so maybe Jack would like to help, but is this not an obvious, good, tangible thing for council officers to be doing, is also regulating these stickers and having access to the database?
That's a good question, and one we had anticipated coming today. So in the self-contained motor vehicles legislation bill, what they're basically proposing is to create a fraudulent offence for councils to investigate quite significant fraud-related activity, which could actually be occurring right across the country. So it's not about somebody purporting to be a self-contained person that's just slapped a sticker on. It's actually about wider, more serious activity, which involves companies that are falsely representing that a motor vehicle is certified as self-contained. So it would be like a motor mechanic who is creating false warrant of fitness stickers for motor vehicles, which is quite significant. We don't see that as something that should sit within local council remit. It's also something that would probably be happening on a district-wide or national level, would require quite significant investigation work, search warrants. But we have proposed that we are quite happy with an infringible offence fine instead, where we could issue a up to $800 fine for somebody that's actually just popped a false self-contained sticker on their camper van.
Okay, thank you. I have a supplementary question then of that. Is there any way the self-containment element can be added to, as you've just said, the warrant of fitness process? And it's just a really good idea.
Yeah, so this... It's flashing. So the amendment does propose to introduce a national certified self-contained system that is held on a national database similar to registrations and warrant of fitnesses. So in order to, for us to ensure whether it's compliant or not, we'd actually be reliant on that national database, as opposed to relying on a sticker that's on a car, which is what we're currently reliant on.
Just while you're there, can you tell us something about the responsible camping ambassadors? I mean, have you had a review? How good is it? Are we wanting to continue them?
So in 2018-19 and 2021, we were successful in getting some money from MB to run a responsible camping ambassador, and it just gave us more human resource or man hours to go out and monitor our sites and conduct some surveys and do some research. So we were very grateful of that. In 21-22, they didn't offer the funding, and I'm assuming that's probably because of COVID, and they assumed there would be less people freedom camping. But this year, the opportunities presented itself again, and we're actually in the process and have completed an application to get some more funding to run the Responsible Camping Ambassadors. And really it's just about educating people that are freedom camping to be responsible campers. And we also encourage them to responsibly camp in the designated sites that we have in our policy.
Councillor Holiday.
Excuse me. Thank you, through Mr. Chair. Just as a general comment, I was just thinking I was a bit concerned that we're fundamentally beginning to undermine the ability for Kiwis to get out and about. But, big but here is that I'm well aware we need to be looking after our environment with regards to things. So the question I've got, would it be fair to say we should be stepping up with potential micro facilities to help enable this freedom camping as such? Or do we just need to think a little bit different? I'm reminded of a modular microsystem that we saw at the LGNZ conference last year that included toilets and washing facility and showers, that sort of stuff, that was pretty much all drive up, park up sort of scenario and solar run. Are we investigating any such technologies as such, or are we investigating how we could potentially be developing our area as, I guess, part of a tourism or a space to come that could facilitate this sort of thing?
It's a question for Hamish, I think.
Yep. I'll provide initial response, and then Jackie might be able to lay it with on the ground. But as you've heard elsewhere, infrastructure can be challenging in how we can provide support for these activities. But part of the work that we have planned is to review our current policy and the approach to freedom camping next year. And so that'll be looking not currently what's there, but also beyond, and looking wholesomely, or holistically around the components of freedom camping and what that looks like. But I do know that there has been some provision, and Jackie will be able to speak to it, some additional support that we've had through funding as well to help meet some of those services in the short term.
So the funding that we did have in the previous few years was just to support the Responsible Camping Ambassador program. The funding wasn't, we weren't able to use the funding for any infrastructure. However, we were able to improve some signage, and we were also able to increase the frequency of the rubbish, the times that we were emptying rubbish bins, and also the cleaning of public facilities. I could just add a little bit more to it. Also, the Freedom Camping Act currently restricts basically enables freedom camping everywhere unless it's restricted in certain areas. And the only way you can really restrict freedom camping in certain areas is through reserve management plans or through a bylaw that's made pursuant to that act. We've proposed that we allow for freedom camping in certain areas as opposed to making it accessible everywhere, because it's quite challenging for local councils to specifically restrict it and justify why it's restricted in every single other area except for those designated sites. So we've just tried to change it slightly through the amendment as well.
And I guess that's sort of what I'm referring to, because to me this is not just a regulatory sort of thing. We've done our regional destination plan, we've done our local destination plan. To me this seems like a really good marketing tool with regards to economic development and tourism in the area as well, targeting New Zealanders to come and enjoy the fantastic Kapiti coast. But we need to have some facilities there for them to do that, and it's just trying to figure out, I guess, cost-effective ways to do that. But I guess going down that economic development pathway might open up other forms of funding to perhaps get that infrastructure in place, potentially. I don't know if there's any work going on in that area at all.
Thanks, Councillor. Always keeping our eye out for opportunities. The Tourism Infrastructure Fund, Tourism Improvement Fund, the new public loos that we're getting are a good example of where we kept our eye out and managed to surf that wave. As Hamish says, we're having a look more holistically next year, and that'll be our opportunity to think more collaboratively and perhaps a bit more aspirationally about where we're going to go in this space. Yes.
Right, Councillor Provano.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Jackie. You're standing up there, so I'm going to ask you another question. In relation to the fines, the $800. I think one of the things that we learnt from the beach bylaw process was that I think it was $700, and that there was really very limited appetite from police to enforce that. So I'm just wondering whether by setting these types of maximum limits, whether or not we're actually going down that same path.
Another very good question, and one we anticipated. So we've set up to 800, unless it's obviously specified through a bylaw, and then that would be up to the local territorial authority to set its own infringement offence amount. And we did think that the proposed amount through the amendment was too high in comparison to other like-minded fines.
Thank you.
Right, anybody else? Otherwise, can somebody move recommendation A, please? Councillor Elliott, seconded by Councillor Holbrook.
Yeah, can I say something?
Oh,
Can it wasn't a question, but I just wanted to say thank you very much to the staff for putting in the submission excluding the homeless people, because people with lots of money can do all of this work in their caravans and etc. And our vulnerable people do not have the funds to do that. And especially when I saw the fines were going up to $800. So I just wanted to thank the staff for excluding the homeless and our vulnerable people in our communities.
I think that's a good point to hijack the process. Recommendation A, moved by Councillor Elliott, seconded by Councillor Holbrook. Right of intro, Councillor Elliott.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kathy. Marvellous point. And I'd like to thank staff very much for your work on this submission. I'm looking forward to hearing how it goes, and definitely looking forward to Council having this discussion next year in the Policy Work Programme. It's been a long time in coming, so thank you all.
Right, debate. Councillor Holliday.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, and look, just building on that, as I just mentioned before, I think there's some great opportunities here from a tourism perspective with regards to attracting people to our area, and that can dovetail into what Kathy was talking about with regards to homeless as well. If we have some base facilities around the place, I think that would be a very good addition to our district and make our district a lot more of an appealing place to come and visit, but also to live in as well. I look forward to that work next year.
Right, recommendation A, moved by Councillor Elliott, seconded by Councillor Holbrook. All those in favour say aye. Those against, carried. Thank you very much.
Mr. Mayor.
Yeah.
I wonder if we could choo-choo lunch, perhaps.
What say all?
So I'm not sure how long this will take, but we do have Bruce here for public speaking, which will, if you have lunch, it will kind of push
So
that
shall I
out.
just push that up?
So yep, if you want to say that we'll do
Yeah,
that.
right. Just hang on a moment. I just want to push one item up just for the convenience of the speaker who's been waiting for some time. We've got a speaker on a matter that's not in the agenda. Will the gentleman step up? I've got your name somewhere.
Bruce.
Oh.
Bruce.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Bruce Henderson. Oh, yeah, of course.
And noting that we will have to come back to.
I'm very aware that I don't want to keep you from lunch for too long. Just for those, the very few of you that I haven't met or worked with at any stage over the last year or two, I'm Bruce Henderson. I'm chair of the Council's Cycleways, Walkways and Bridleways Advisory Group. but I'm also, in this case, representing a couple of members of the Road Safety Advisory Group, who that group sort of hasn't met for a while, so, but they did want me to record their thanks as well. It's just as we arrive at the end of this triennium, we're very aware that there's going to be a lot of changes in personnel. Some of you will be staying, some of you will be going, there'll be new people here. So over the last 3 years, it's been a very productive working relationship with the people we've worked with, both on council and in many cases with the community boards as well. So we just wanted to record our thanks to all the people that we have worked with who've been so supportive over that time. Particularly a number of people, Councillor Bernie Randall for his chair of the Road Safety Advisory Group, Councillors Jocelyn Pravanov and Angela Boswell, our two members of our Cycleways, Walkways, Bridleways Advisory Group, Councillor James Coots, is James here? I can't see him. Not here at the moment. For all his work on the transport portfolio, and I've got to record at this stage also the many professional conversations he and I have had over our back fence. We happen to be next door neighbours. And Councillor Sophie Hanford, I really must thank also for her boundless enthusiasm, anything to do with walking or riding in this district. It was really heartening to hear your comments before, or various people's comments about mode shift and public transport, because that's something that's very dear to my heart as well, so thank you very much. And last but definitely not least, thank you, Mayor Guru, for all your work at the helm of the organisation over the last 3 years. It's very much appreciated. And also I'd like to record our thanks also to the staff that have worked behind the scenes. You know, there are too many of you to name by individually, but we've just had fantastic support. And we're in really good heart. I think we're excited about not only what we've done in the last 3 years, but what we expect to be able to do over the next triennium. I do think it's important, just as a side note, that the Road Safety Advisory Group does get reconstituted. I think it can work as in a complementary role with our CWB group as we work through things like Road to Zero and Streets for People and all of those different initiatives that are coming in nationally, because I think a lot of them, particularly with climate change and emissions control and things like that, you know, we play an important role in that. So I do think that group does need to be fully reconstituted at some stage. So just to record, thank you all for your hard work. It's been much appreciated, and I look forward to the next 3 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. I'm sure, Bruce, I'm sure a lot of the members here, the elected members and staff, would like to thank you for the job that you've done and the committee that you've led in a very important area of our district, because one of the things attractive about the district is exactly the sort of things that you do. And
Thank
I
you very
know
much.
when you put your hand up and volunteer, we appreciate that
Thank
very
you.
much. Thank you.
Very much. Thanks, everyone.
Right, on that note, lunch is provided. Bang on 1 o'clock, can we make it? Yes.